you know, I got interested in, especially interested in ecological restoration and land health about 1968, 69. I was in medical school at the time. I took a year off from medical school because I wasn't so sure I wanted to work with sick people. And not so sure I want to work with sick landscapes either, but that's kind of where we are. That's what I decided to do. And one of the fundamental things in that first year of medical school, one of the fundamental emphasis was you have to know what a healthy functioning body is. What is a healthy blood pressure? What is a healthy temperature? What are the warning signs that the body's health is getting out of whack? What is the blood chemistry and so on? You examine parts of the body, but it was all done in it was the whole system. The goal of doctors isn't just to keep you a healthy liver, right? Healthy liver and the rest of it's not working, you're not going to be in good health. Well, those same kinds of principles, I started looking at forested landscapes in particular from that perspective. What are the characteristics of a healthy landscape? One of the first sets of papers that I read in that regard was back to Aldo Leopold. You know, a lot of the ideas he developed here in the Southwest. And Leopold, you know, asserted that if we're going to practice land health, first we have to know what we had to start with. What were the naturally self-regulating landscapes that were present before we started changing disturbance regimes and introducing novel management actions on the land. The second paper that I encountered was by David Rasmussen, and what he did is he wrote a paper called Diagnosing and Treating Ecosystem Health. And in there he listed a range of types of measurements that we can make of ecosystem health, suggested ways that we might be able to set sideboards on what the healthy function of ecosystems might be, including biodiversity, hydrologic processes, net primary productivity, trophic interactions, you know, food webs and all of that stuff. It was all very interesting. It was all very conceptual, but it wasn't really tied to specific ecosystems. There weren't many examples to look at. What I think a lot of us are doing now in applied ecology is trying to understand better what those limits are. What are the characteristics of healthy ecosystems? How do we diagnose where we are? How do we forecast what the future might hold, given the basic structure and function of ecosystems? So with that as introduction, I'd like to get right into my talk, and I've got a kind of a sweeping landscape context. I'm gradually getting up to trying to think at the scale of about 10 to 12 million acres as a landscape, and trying to look at time from the scale of about the past 50 million years, and then look out into the future just 100 to a few hundred years. So with that, let's go ahead and hit the slides here. So here's what I'm going to talk about. Where are we today? My focus is going to be on frequent fire forest in the western United States. Although I'm going to try to emphasize southwestern forest, it's really western frequent fire forest. Where have we been? And I'm going to start out about 50 million years ago with that, and we'll work our way up to the present pretty quickly. How did we get here? And how did we get here is not just how did we get here in the human era, which is a little blip in evolutionary time. You know, humans have only been around, even if you put it Australopithecines and all of that, we're just a little bitty short time in that framework. Where are we going? What should we do? That's a question I'm not going to answer, but that's what we're talking about right here with these workshops. And then finally, I'll talk a little bit about the Southwestern Ecological Restoration Institutes. Most of you know the background. The Southwestern Ecological Restoration Institutes were established by authorizing legislation by Congress in 2004. They were chartered by the Western Governors Association in 2005. We have the three institutes, the New Mexico Institute that Ken is from, Tony's Institute in Colorado, and then the Institute in Arizona. In our authorizing legislation, It was a stepwise process. We start out by working in the greater Southwest, Colorado, New Mexico, Arizona. And then once we've kind of proved out and developed how to work to provide the scientific and technical support that's needed for restoration, then to expand that to West-wide. So where we are right now is trying to provide service in Region 2 and Region 3, but what our direction is to expand that West-wide. And that is a stretching exercise. Because all of this happens with no increase in budget. You know how that works. We're trying to work smarter, not harder, but it seems like we're working harder. Okay, so when we talk about large landscapes, in general systems thinking, instead of calling them landscapes, we refer to those as greater ecosystems. So what are greater ecosystems? They're regional complexes of ecosystems. In the original thinking about ecosystems, most people were thinking about a few hundred acres, a few thousand acres. That's a little bit too small because all of these ecosystems interact and they're linked to other ecosystems on the landscape. So where we are right now in thinking about ecosystem dynamics is that we're thinking that greater ecosystems are on the scale of 1 million to 10 million acres, generally speaking. There are some exceptions to that, but generally when you look at all of the interactions and how ecosystems, individual ecosystems are linked, it's not just the ponderosa pine ecosystem or the pinyon juniper ecosystem. The greater ecosystem typically sweeps up from, in the Southwest, from desert to alpine tundra. So it's a big area. They have common landscape level characteristics, similar climatic changes over time. You know, a cold front comes through, it doesn't just hit the pinyon juniper ecosystem, it hits all of those ecosystems in the elevational gradient. They're linked by wide-ranging wildlife. Most wildlife don't just hunker down in one type, but they go across ecosystems. Landscape scale disturbance regimes, and boy, are we familiar with that. And then human, social, and political systems all link these ecosystems together, so they have to be all of our management actions, all of our assessments of disturbance dynamics, and we're talking about restoration of desired conditions, we have to be able to stretch ourselves up to think on a very large scale, not just 10,000 acres, but millions of acres. So what is ecological restoration? Let's go through the background of this. You know, talking about Aldo Leopold, of course Aldo Leopold is the founder of the whole concept of ecological restoration. And he developed those ideas right here in the Southwest. So it's based on evolutionary biology and ecosystem ecology. So I'm going to talk about that a little bit more in the presentation. Reference conditions are fundamental. I'm going to talk about reference conditions. And reference conditions are related to desired conditions, which I'll talk about in just a few minutes. But a lot of people, when they're thinking reference conditions, are just thinking of pre-settlement conditions. You know, what happened what were these systems like just before Euro-American disruption of natural disturbance regimes, or Native American disruption of natural disturbance regimes, and so on. So I'll talk about that a bit. Generally speaking, once you've determined what the blood pressure is, the temperature, natural temperature is, the natural parts and characteristics of the system are, in a sense, if you're thinking of a human health analogy, then you want to look at departures from that very carefully. Is it a significant departure? If your body temperature is 98.6, that's kind of the average. If we took all of our temperatures in here, some of us would be 97.8, some of us would be 99.1, and so on, but that's kind of the average. I hope we're all healthy. But we'd vary a little bit. There'd be some natural range of variability in that temperature. But there are clear thresholds. If your temperature is over 101 degrees, there's something not right in your system. You've got some kind of illness. If it's below 97, there's something wrong with your system. So there are limits to these ranges of departure that we can achieve and have a self-regulating, sustainable ecosystem. You go to the hospital and you've got a temperature of 97 degrees, you're not going to be in real good shape. But in a hospital, they can keep your body functioning unless something else goes wrong. If you've got a very high temperature and you're in the hospital, they can put you in ice baths. They can do some intensive management to help you get to the point where you can be self-regulating again. Absent that, there tends to be a spiral of decreasing organ function, tissue disruption, and so on, and the system falls apart. The same thing's true with these large, greater ecosystems with landscapes. This is a final point that I like to bring forward, is that between the two extremes, we tend to have kind of nature babies, which is how I came into this line of work in a way, much to my family's chagrin. But, you know, the naturalistic model and a kind of a more agricultural or engineering way of thinking about landscapes. I came from a ranching and farming family, and they didn't want natural conditions on the land. You know, that's how we made a living. But there's those two kinds of extremes. But it's not polar opposites. You can work in harmony with natural tendencies and have departures from reference conditions or natural conditions. Again, within limits. We're trying to figure out what those limits are. Okay, so where are we today? I think everyone's aware of this. It's like Jeremiah up here coming out of the Bible and talking to you. But the greater ecosystems of the West are falling the hell apart. You know, there is clear evidence of it. We're all seeing this. We're seeing trophic webs disrupted, bizarre behavior with population eruptions and population crashes of wildlife, insects, and so on. We're seeing a rapid spread of invasive exotic plant species. We're seeing decreased natural diversity and increased bizarre diversity, something that hasn't happened in recent evolutionary time as these exotic plants and animals spread across the landscape. By animals, I include insects and so on. Unnatural disturbance regimes. The one that's caught most people's attention in the West, well, the two are bark beetles, I think. Isn't that right, Tony? Do y'all have some bark beetles up there?
Just a few.
And fire. You know, those are one, but those are just the most egregious examples of the symptoms of ecosystems that are falling apart. So the future, absent some extensively and pretty aggressively applied management, is a continuing spiraling decline of not only the ecological health of the land, but the social health of the land. We're seeing this. You drive around the rural West and you see towns falling apart, and because the economy's not healthy anymore. Well, I think that's our challenge as professional foresters and natural resource managers, is how do we restore not just the ecological health of these greater ecosystems, but the economic and social health of these greater ecosystems. So let's start 70 million years ago or so. This evolutionary ecology of frequent fire forests goes back at least 70 million years. We have clear, good records in the fossil record from 50 million years ago of frequent fire forest. That extensive areas of long-needle pine forest and associated frequent fire trees show up in the fossil record about 70 million years ago, and for the next 20 million years, they became the dominant forest type on the planet. So they provided very crucial evolutionary habitat for the post-dinosaur era of rapid proliferation of megafauna, all of that sort of stuff. At 25 million years ago, that's years before the present, YBP, we have evidence of long-needle pine, ponderous pine forest in southwestern Colorado. And in that intervening time, from 25 million years ago, these frequent fire forests were dominant in North America, not just in the United States, but in North America. So they've been characteristic for millions and millions of years. Now, they've never stayed at one point over evolutionary time. They move around, of course. So they, like all of these other plants and animals, frequent fire forests have tracked favorable climatic conditions. They've gone up in elevation, they've gone up or down in latitude, they move around, but they've always been present over very large areas in North America. During that period of time, in the past 70 million years, these frequent fire forests and all of their component members have evolved self-regulatory mechanisms, whether you're looking at trophic dynamics, you're looking at seedling establishment through maturation, insect and disease attack, fire regimes, and so on. These self-regulating mechanisms that have allowed them to adapt to some striking climatic changes. So what's happened with climate and CO2? So, you get in and you say, oh gosh, climate's changing and carbon dioxide concentrations are going up. Oh, worry me, what are we going to do? These ecosystems have experienced this over evolutionary time and handled it quite well. They've been very resilient. Well, let's look at how this has changed over time. So, these wide swings have been characteristic. So you have kind of quiescent periods where there's not a great change in CO2 or great changes in temperature. And then very often when you look at the fossil record, there are sudden changes. And by sudden, I mean within 100 years. The kind of stuff that's coming at us for sure this century. Wide swings in temperature, wide swings in CO2 concentration. So let's look at when these frequent fire forests became common. So they showed up in the Eocene they were well established, 58 to 48 million years before the present. At that time, CO2 concentration was 1,100 parts per million. Right now, we've got some big changes in CO2 concentration that occurred just in our lifetimes. When I was born, it was about 305 parts per million. It's currently about 380, 390 parts per million and going up. But these ecosystems in the past have done quite well under high CO2 concentrations and under very low CO2 concentrations. We've had sudden changes in temperature. You go back to the fossil record all the way back to the Eocene, and you see everything's cool, then it gets hotter, then it gets colder, and we had the ice ages that we have pretty well documented over the past several million years where it's swung back and forth. But some of these changes have been very, very rapid. The best documentation that we have is in the Holocene since about 11,700 years ago or so. And during that period, in that Holocene warming period, temperatures increased in less than 100 years by 4 degrees centigrade. Even our most, the most severe changes that we're expecting to experience in the next 100 years, it's about 3 or 4 degrees centigrade. Well, this happened just 12,000 years ago. Plants and animals did pretty good in that circumstance. But they did well when they had natural food web structures, natural vegetation structures, and natural disturbance regimes. Where we are today is a far cry from that. Food webs are fragile. Forest conditions are such that they are not resilient to the kinds of disturbances that are coming down. So we see this intersection then of landscapes that have gotten more and more out of whack, and we're entering into a very rapid climate change. I'd say we're in it. 2011 was part of it. 2002 was part of it. 2000 was part of it. 1988 was part of it. So we're seeing what happens to these landscapes in the presence of climate change. So what's coming at us? In '94, I wrote a paper with a cast of thousands that was called Historical and Anticipated Changes in Forest Ecosystems of the Inland West. And we looked at western red cedar and juniper forest and everything in between, and put all of this in a historical context, looked at how it had changed, especially since settlement. Didn't really go back to 58 million years ago. I'm working on a paper right now on that. But in that paper, when we analyzed all of this, looked at all of the trends in the vegetation, this was our key point, was that We anticipate an acceleration of historical changes in the inland west, including increased fuel accumulation, lengthened fire seasons, and intensified burning conditions, all contributing to larger and more catastrophic fires. In a separate part of the paper, we talked about larger and more catastrophic insect and disease attacks. So, a couple of things of that. We've got fuel accumulation going on, and part of that is because we've excluded the natural fire regimes. But another part of that is, as you know from your botany classes, your ecology classes, the most limiting factor to plant growth is CO2 concentration followed by water. And so as we increase CO2 concentration, plants grow faster. You can graph fuel accumulation in the boreal forest that is largely uninhabited in those areas, and there's accelerated fuel accumulation in that forest that the graph of rate of fuel accumulation overlies exactly the increase in CO2 concentration the past 100 years. So this is accelerating the fuel accumulation across these greater ecosystems. Okay, let's go to the next slide. So how did we get here? And there's the litany. Now the first thing, overgrazing, get rid of landscape scale fuels, the grasses and wildflowers. That stops fire. Then we start active fire suppression, and that accelerates the exclusion of fire. Predator control from a trophic dynamics point of view. You know, that there's a lot of very interesting information coming out of Yellowstone right now with the reintroduction of the wolf in that system. Well, those are now coming back because the kind of couch potato elk are not just lurking around down in the wet areas and over browsing it. The grizzly bear population is thriving because wolves kill animals and grizzlies chase them off. You know, so things are looking pretty good when you have the natural trophic dynamics. But this whole predator control thing has really altered food webs that again affect greater ecosystems. Fire exclusion and then followed by fire suppression. Overcutting of old growth trees. There are many species of in the frequent fire forest that are dependent upon not just large trees, but very old trees. Trees that have a lot of lightning strikes, for example, dead bark, cavities in them, and so on. Failure to control density of young trees. It's very hard to control density when you have an overabundance of young trees to safely control it, especially when they get to be 10 feet tall or so. Introduction of invasive exotic species, and then unplanned and poorly engineered road systems. And then finally, this is the major functional problem that we've got, is that we're still trying to adapt. We're still trying to figure out how the heck can we get on top of this problem? How can we pay for treatments? What can we do? What are the range of treatments? And what desired conditions do we want to leave for future generations? So I'm not going to read through all of this, but you know, this whole symptom of declining ecosystem health, watershed is going to be increasingly important as we have become overpopulated and are headed that way in more and more areas of the West. Water is going to be prominent. Did a project with a grad student about 10 years ago where we looked at just the Salt River watershed. And what we looked at is the outflow below Roosevelt Dam. What's demonstrated from about 1906 or so to the present is a decline of about 180,000 acre-feet in flow. When you take out the climate signal, you take out changes in precipitation and so on using hydrologic models. Now, in looking at 180,000 acre-feet, it's a good chunk of water. Well, that matters when you're talking about meeting water needs downstream. That exactly tracks the increase in tree density, just as we think. So you can look at all of these components, the trophic webs, you can look at hydrologic function, you can look at erosion processes, look at aesthetics value, look at potential wood utilization and so on. And all of these are, when you look at each of these individual factors, current conditions are far outside of the capability of the land to be sustainable and resilient. So I mentioned this earlier, but, and Corbin, I think you made an excellent point there, is that Rodeo Chedeschi is not an outlier. The Biscuit Fire, the Hayman Fire, those are not outliers. Those are very large fires. But it's not just the large fires, it's when we talk about failure of social and political systems to adapt, we're building in exactly the beautiful canyons and so on, where relatively small fires, a few thousand acres, can be devastating, can cost $1 billion. You know, the 47,000 acre Cerro Grande fire, that's not 47,000 acres these days. We call that hey, that's nice. It was only 47,000 acres. But if it burns through a developed area, a built environment, it is devastating socially and politically and economically. So when you look at comprehensively the environmental impacts of fire, too often what we look at is just the suppression cost, and those are not trivial. You know, $300 an acre, you have a 1 million acre fire, that's $300 million. That's a good chunk of change. But if you look at the comprehensive costs, as I was talking about just before, homes and infrastructure are going to be increasingly a major part of the cost of these fires, and civilian lives. Wildlife and human habitats are degraded over long periods of time, hundreds of years. Watersheds and water supply impacts, recreation facilities, evacuation costs, all of these other things add up. And there's typically a multiplier of somewhere around, at the low end, 3, and at the high end, around 20 times our fire suppression costs. It's the actual economic cost, just in the short term, of these severe fires. Now, you remember in 2002 when we used to have a lot of pinyon pine in our country down here in the Southwest? Well, this is coming in a big way. We look at just the simple models that exist for the outbreak of bark beetles or defoliating insects, fur engraver beetle, and you look at those, where we are right now, and intersect that with climate change. And we are going to be seeing in the near future, on the scale of 100,000 acres, insect kills across the landscape in the western United States. We're already seeing it in lodgepole pine. We've seen it in pinyon juniper. Down here, we have seen a little in ponderosa pine. But in the next 10 to 20 years, we're going to see a lot across these greater ecosystems. Of course, that has implications for fire behavior. If you thought the wall of fire was hot, just imagine all those trees dead, brown needles on them. You would have probably seen it from Mars, not just from the space shuttle. Okay, so now where are we now? We're trying to figure out what to do. We're the experts. Society's asking us, help. You know, you got to do something about this. And a lot of laymen, like Corbin was talking about, have some strong opinions about how we should do this. And we should listen to, get all kinds of creative ideas. I don't discount that at all. But it has to start with what we know. And this is a phrase that I've used for years. About almost half of you in here are former students of mine, so you've heard this before. But it's, you start with the best available knowledge. By scientific knowledge, I include social science, political science knowledge as well. If you don't have a clear understanding of the scientific knowledge and clear objectives for desired resource uses and ecosystem conditions, desired conditions, and a process of systematic knowledge discovery and use. What is that? There's some research that you do, you know. That's what the institutes do, is we try to do some research. But it's fundamentally going to be an adaptive management project. We don't have time to do 40 years of studying and then start solving this problem. We're going to have to take our best guesses, try a range of things on the landscape, and see what holds up to the test of time. See what stands up to these big landscape scale fires. But absent that, what we get, and I participate and have for some time since the first planning rule in a lot of public involvement stuff, you wind up with some charitably, I'll call it ill-informed speculation, subjective judgment, bias, ideology gets in there to a certain extent, personal policy preferences. I don't like chainsaws, I like chainsaws. I like fire, I don't like fire, those sorts of things. That you wind up with these very unpleasant surprises. You wind up doing things that don't really make a difference. Imagine going into the doctor, and you talk to the doctor, and the doctor says, you know what you need to lower your blood pressure. Blood pressure is just too high. But before you do anything about this, let's assemble a collaborative group, and we'll sit down, and we'll talk about blood pressure. And we'll say, how many of you think that a blood pressure of 180 over 105 is too high? Raise your hands. Okay, so you do that, and you say, well, sounds okay. I think you're okay. Well, no, that's not what we do. We're the land health professionals. We have to say, now, wait a minute. We know that when the blood pressure is that high, something bad's going to happen real soon to you. Organs are going to cease to work. You're going to have a stroke. You're going to have a heart attack, that sort of thing. Well, we have to speak truth to power, which is what Corbin was talking about. We have to speak truth to power to the general public and say, look, here's the evidence. The evidence is you can't carry 400 trees per acre in a frequent fire forest and have that forest stand up to an ignition. So that's, I think, our fundamental job. Okay, so real quickly, many of you have seen this slide before. This is just some of the changes. Our last best information about reference conditions was it just before settlement. We've done a lot of reconstructions. This is from the Pearson area in 1876, and about 23 trees per acre. Current conditions, about 1,200 trees per acre. Blood pressure is way too high. That is not going to make it into the future. So what do we do about that? Well, my simple solution to it, I've got a very simple mind here. So I came here in '75 and I said, hey, fire exclusions caused the problem. Well, hey, I got drip torch. We'll just reintroduce fire. Those early experiments in the first 4 years demonstrated that was a very effective way to kill the old growth trees and not thin out the post-settlement trees. So that's not a treatment that's going to work. That led us then to look at combinations of mechanical thinning and then reintroducing the fire. So if your blood pressure is 180 over 105, we know that exercise would be good for you. That will help you get back into a self-regulating condition. But before you get on that treadmill, we need to get your blood pressure down into a range where you can get on the treadmill and not die. In a way, that's what we're doing with trying to mechanically treat the fuels before we introduce the treadmill of fire to help you self-regulate across greater ecosystems. So one of the questions that we have when we look at reference conditions is very often people say, well, pre-settlement conditions are just a snapshot in time. Well, yeah, that's true. But in determining reference conditions, we look at converging lines of evidence. So we look not just at dendrochronological reconstructions, early plot data, early forest inventories. That's one point of information for 1880 to 1910, somewhere in that region. But we also look at relic sites where fire has continued to play a natural role, where they haven't been overgrazed or had fire suppression. We've got a great example here, to an extent, pretty good example, Powell Plateau over in Arizona, Grand Canyon National Park. Not a bad example. There's been some fire regime disruption, but functioning pretty good. Church Mesa, Zion, pretty nice place. Our best examples in North America are down in the Sierra Tarahumara in Mexico, where there's some huge plateaus. Powell Plateau is a fairly small island. It's hard to get a self-sustaining landscape scale disturbance regime on a site like that. But down in Mexico, there's some large areas that have uninterrupted fire regimes, and those frequent fire forests look just like the pre-settlement forest did. That gives us some confidence that we're in that same area. Now, the other thing we do is, there's this place that's the first research site, for the Forest Service, the Fort Valley Experimental Forest. But we have other areas around. This has been studied all to hell. It's hard to step on a piece of the Fort Valley experimental forest where someone else hasn't stepped with a ruler, or a tape measure, or something, hanging off the belt. But we have other areas. Pringle Falls up at Oregon on the Deschutes is another experimental forest, very good. Black Hills National Forest, I've had some plots in there since 93 or so. And in all of these cases, where the soils are similar, we see the same reference conditions. It's highly unlikely that in 1870, all of these sites were in some unique situation historically where they had the same conditions. I can take the data for trees, not for understory vegetation, species composition. The data from Pringle Falls, there's 22 trees per acre, 23 trees per acre. Group size is the same, so on. But they're on similar soil types. This area in the Black Hills that we put in 93, the same thing. But again, these reference conditions are similar because they were similar soil types and elevation, not the same climatic regime. One of the things about frequent fire pine forest is that with frequent fire, frequent fire tends to override a lot climatic regime. If it's burning every 5 to 10 years, that's going to be the key structuring element in the landscape. So, one of the things that we first did is we were trying to build out this restoration science in the Southwest. It is, let's use intensive ecological restoration treatments to establish some facsimile, as close as we can, to a naturally functioning ecosystem. And then reintroduce natural disturbance regimes and measure in detail on these small areas what the natural structure and function is like. And that provides what he called the base datum, 98.6 degrees, for the human body. Blood pressure of 105/70, something in that range, those sorts of things. Well, these active restoration treatments we refer to as strict sense restoration. So some of you have been to this site, 12-acre site on the Fort Valley Experimental Forest, the Pearson Restoration Experiment. And what we did was basically this: retain trees which predate settlement, and there were an abundance of them there because it had not been logged. Retain sufficient post-settlement trees to reestablish pre-settlement conditions and patterns. Thin and remove the excess trees, and some of you, I don't think anyone here actually worked on that. We picked that stuff up and hauled it off. I mean, it was a light on the land treatment. We raked heavy fuels from the base of the trees, and we do that. We suggest doing that when you've got an abundance of old growth trees to prevent them from getting cambial scar, but cambial kill from the fire. But we raked out to the drip line of the canopies because we didn't want that heavy fuel accumulation that wouldn't kill the tree to create an unnatural seed bed for herbaceous vegetation status. So we raked that material off, took it off, and then reintroduced fire. We're burning that site on about a 4-year interval. We know from the fire scars that we've collected throughout the area, it burned on about a 2 to 6 year interval, back to about 400 years ago, as far back as we go. And then in that case, we seeded with native species and intensively controlled exotics. So this is kind of a strict sense restoration treatment. We can't afford to do that over millions of acres. However, it's providing an important piece of base data, an understanding of what the natural structure and function of these ecosystems is. And this is what you look at. Some of you have been out there. This is a before shot. Before, it was about 23 trees per acre, as I said. After the population eruption of trees in there is about 1,200 trees per acre. You can see this is an old growth tree, about 260 years old. This one's about 380 years old. You can just see a sliver of it here. Here it is after treatment. This is 6 years after treatment. Abundance of bunch grasses and wildflowers in there. You can now actually see some of the old growth trees in there. We did leave a cushion. It was 23 trees per acre. We left about 60 trees per acre because we expected some blowdown, we expected some ice, some snow damage to the small spindly trees, some of which we had to leave as replacement trees. Our intent is to go in 4 years' time and readjust that to get it back to about 23 trees per acre. Then, so that would be a strict sense restoration treatment. But what we're going to be dealing with over most of the landscape is not a strict sense treatment. We've got other ideas in mind for these landscapes than just a completely self-regulated landscape. Most of us do anyway. So you change that basic prescription to achieve specific resource objectives. So for example, you might leave more trees to accommodate screening cover for human or wildlife habitat, especially in hunted populations, you need some cover. Future wood harvesting possibilities and other uses like that. You might leave fewer trees to accommodate other objectives, view sheds, wildlife goals, grazing, maybe increasing spring and seep flows for a very important spring or seep that in the greater ecosystems needed for biodiversity reasons and so on. So we change those basic prescriptions, but again, when we are developing these changed prescriptions away from reference conditions, it's incumbent upon us to use the best scientific information we've got about what that means for long-term resilience and sustainability of the ecosystem. If we're not going to have all the information we need, and that's why the management as experiment is going to be important, adaptive management. And here's just some alterations on this. This isn't from the Grand Canyon Forest, Greater Grand Canyon Forest Partnership, now called the Greater Flagstaff Forest Partnership. That's not a natural restoration treatment. It's got about 3 times as many trees as you would leave to restore completely natural conditions. This is another one that has fewer trees than in natural conditions because it's to the southwest and downhill. If we were standing here and looking down here, we'd be looking down at about a 20% slope from a housing development. So want to be sure what comes into there is surface fire, just a grass fire. So it's got fewer trees. And this is one, I call this a boutique restoration tree. This was the view of restoration in an area actually in New Mexico where the local homeowners didn't want to have a lot of trees removed, so they knock off some limbs and stuff. And that's not going to stand up to fire when it comes through. So that's 104 degrees, 105 degrees temperature. Not going to work. So another thing we've tried to do is try to find where the limits are for this. And we know that alternative restoration prescriptions produce very different outcomes. Just looking at fire behavior. Let's look at some of these real quick. So here's we have these in New Mexico and Arizona and Colorado where we have side-by-side replicated experiments that are on a scale of about 30 acres. So we have control areas, we have a strict sense restoration treatment, we have compromised restoration treatments that might be leaving 3 times as many trees as reference conditions, or it might be just a burn-only prescription. Grand Canyon National Park wanted some burn-only prescriptions. We've got some of those out there too. They have very different results. So this is a burn-only in the fall of one of those plots. This is kind of what it looks like in the cartoon. And this is 74 degrees, I think it was, a backing fire that got pretty dynamic. This is not working. I've done a lot of this in my first 4 years out here in the Southwest. Not a good idea. This is a minimal thinning treatment the same day, and you can see some pretty dynamic behavior. There's about 4 times as many trees here as are natural under reference conditions. This area underbehave will crown. That's leaving too many trees. And this is a full restoration treatment where we have about 30 trees per acre, a few more than reference conditions in this particular area. And you can see it's surface fire. There's very low probability of any kind of crown fire in that area. One of the things we do as well is to these experiments where we actually go in and burn them after we've thinned them, is that we go through modeling analyses. So this is just one example of that. Here we are for some plots here around Flagstaff in the Greater Flagstaff Forest Partnership area around Flagstaff. And in 1876, for this particular plot, It had 47 trees per acre in pre-settlement times. In 97, at the time the experiment was put in, it had 383 trees per acre. Big increase in trees. With our 1.5 to 1 replacement level, we'd leave 70 trees per acre. That's 1.5 times 47. With a 3 to 1 ratio, because a lot of people are saying, let's just take out a little bit of the cancer, you know, and then we'll come back in 20 years and take out the rest of it. There's 141 trees per acre, 3 times as many. Well, let's look at behave model. Surface fire, active crown fire. Surface fire, passive crown fire. So we can analyze it in that respect. And we need to divulge this to stakeholders as well and say, you do this, this is what's likely to happen. The percent of crown is 0 under pre-settlement, 100% here, 20% here, 69% there. Are you okay with 69% of the area torching? If so, that's your treatment. Amount of heat generated. I'll fight that with a rake and a shovel. I'm gonna get out of the way of that one. This one, that's a little dangerous. This one, clearly, you don't want people out in front of a fire on a windy day with that one. But look at other things, herbaceous response, water response, and so on. We can do all of this. We've got good science that allows us to analyze these treatments for these different responses. This one would have almost 900 pounds per acre of grasses and wildflowers. This one, 112, this one, 571, and this one, 134. So there are some thresholds. When you get up to leaving just, you think, well, you know, it's not that much more, we'll just double the number of trees. Well, it cuts herbaceous and wildflowering and forage production by more than half. It cuts it down to about 25%, by about 3/4. So anyway, these are the kinds of analyses that we need to bring into our judgment when we're deciding what we're going to do in restoring these large landscapes. And you all know this. It needs no elaboration. Next time. So what can be done? This we think, all of us, I'm not talking about the institutes here, but this is what we think. Insist on comprehensive greater ecosystem restoration. We got to bump it up to the scale that these disturbances are occurring at. Use scientifically rigorous and operational adaptive management approaches. Management is experiment to find out what works on the landscapes, on these large landscapes. And here we get into the political and social science arena. Tony's been real good at teaching me on this one over the years that I've known him, is you gotta take this collaborative approach with public lands. We have to bring them in. We have to help them understand the basic structure and function of these ecosystems so they can engage productively as stakeholders, people that have to live with the outcome of these treatments over these greater ecosystems. I think we're getting there. In the Collaborative Forest Landscape Restoration Program, you know, the minimum size, I think, was, wasn't it 50,000 acres? Is that right, Diane? Yeah. So it has to be at least 50,000 acres. That's way too small. It needs to be much bigger than that. So if it's 1 to 10 million acres, what's an acceptable area for us to work on? I'm saying somewhere around 500,000 acres or 1 million acres. Unless it's an isolated island out there, we need to be looking at that scale. It's a challenge, but it can be done. These CFLRP projects that are spread around Arizona, New Mexico, and Colorado, and throughout the West are figuring out how to make that happen in a collaborative process. And so this is the marketing of the Southwest Ethological Restoration Institute slide. What do we do? Our job is to provide the best evidence available to agency professionals, elected officials, and other stakeholders. Here's what the knowledge suggests. We're translational. We're supposed to put together the best available knowledge, whether it's from primary research or secondary research, and translate that into a form that's useful, and then get it out there. We're trying to figure out how to get it into the hands of people. We produce systematic reviews that are 200 pages. How many people read that? We read that. Okay, and then, so we boil it down to the 30-page summary. How many people read that? Mostly we read that, and other academics, and some specialists. But, so we're trying to figure out how to do that. We produce the one-page fact sheet. You can't get it down to one sentence. Pictures help, graphics help, field trips help. Field trips are one of the most powerful ways to get people to understand how these systems operate. We work in a collaborative process for cooperative knowledge application, especially with agencies, but also with general stakeholders. And then a final function that works out, we did a study about, was it 10 years ago, I think, Diane, where we surveyed people in the Southwest and asked them who they trust for information about forest ecology and management. And number 1 and 2 were kind of tied. It was the Forest Service and the universities. And then far down the list come in NGOs, environmental groups, industrial advocates, you know, the Arizona Cattle Growers Association, Timber Association, and so on. So we have very high credibility. That's our role. However, we've noticed that in these workshops that we're doing, we've noticed that if the Forest Service convenes a workshop, some people, especially the strongest skeptics, look at a Forest Service convened workshop as a loaded situation. They don't really want to listen to us. They're just going to try to argue us into saying that we support what they want to do. Universities, however, are still viewed by the public as objective conveners. So we think that the institutes convening workshops, we know from research that the institutes convening workshops is going to produce probably a more trusted dialogue, especially at the extremes. Now, as you talk about all these problems over time, I always am trying to balance things are going to hell in a handbasket with, it's not so bad, we can do something about this. Well, we can do something about this. We do have a bit of time to make these things happen. We don't have 40 years. We may have 20 years to really make this happen. So we've got to get our act together in a big scale. We know it works at the scale. 10 years ago I said, we know it works at the scale of 5 acres. We now know that restoration works at the scale of 1,000+ acres. We now need to get it up to the greater ecosystem scale. There's no fooling around here. 50,000 acres is too little. It's too little, too late. We've got to be operating at the scale 500,000, million to 10 million acres. We have to figure out how to do multi-scale collaborative approaches. Most collaborative groups, it's hard to get a collaborative group together that will seriously look at the states of Arizona, New Mexico, and Colorado and try to come up with a restoration plan. People are most comfortable with, because our step size is not that great. If we were 1,000 feet tall, you know, we'd be able to deal with bigger landscapes. But given our current situation, we've got to find some way to get people to get their minds around these bigger problems that must be addressed. And as a key part of that, communities and local governments have major leadership roles to play. And it has to be at least at the state level, I think. Ideally, the multi-state level. It's hard to get serious work done at the multi-state level outside of the federal government. But somehow we've got to deal with that. How do we get that collaborative engagement at a large enough scale where we can really approach solving these problems? And so, just in conclusion, we're talking about desired conditions here. Desired conditions are a key element in ecological restoration. We need to be sure that those desired conditions are consistent with the scientific evidence. I think the strongest case for desired conditions is made when you start with reference conditions That is, the kinds of conditions where the systems were self-regulating. And then you state why you're departing from those conditions, what you hope to achieve. One example that's an easy one for me in Flagstaff and Sedona and Camp Verde, down in the valley, is that I don't think most people want a third of the forest burning every summer. Probably not. The smoke, when we burn 300 acres, people go crazy, with the smoke generated from that. So we probably don't want a natural smoke regime unless everybody goes away during the summers. So we want different from the completely natural system, but as we're trying to approach this difference, we need to do that with the best available information available. We need to say, okay, we think this, we try it, and if we get too many phone calls and too many people dying, which happens with smoke, then no, we don't do that. We're going to have to back off from it in some way. So just restoration is not some kind of high church with a pinch-nose sense of rectitude. That's not restoration, that sort of thing. But it really is that broad area of working with natural tendencies to try to get these systems into a condition that is somewhat more self-regulating and certainly much more resilient.